take a deep breath and just let my voice carry you straight into the dark. Imagine it's 2 a.m. on a lonely Illinois highway. The air is freezing, but you're suffocating in the back of a steel trunk. Your chest is tight. The car is hitting 80 miles an hour. Right next to you, your partner is shivering out of pure terror. You don't know where you're heading, but you can still see the driver's eyes in your mind, cold, dead, no soul in him. That man was Roosevelt Daniels. Now we've all heard about folks getting snatched up. We read it, see it on the news, and shake our heads. But tonight, we ain't just talking about the news. We're stepping into that pitch black trunk with them. We ain't using no flashy graphics, because real evil lives in the shadows where you can't see it coming. Tonight, we look at a man who didn't just break the law, he played with it. And as we walk through this dark night, I want you to ask yourself, are we doing the right thing by looking into this darkness? Lord knows we are, because if you don't understand the monster, you'll never see him when he's standing right behind you. If your spirit is strong enough, stay with me. Let's get into it. The Midnight Hunt. The year is 1976. Back then, the streets of Illinois had their own rules, and the night belonged to those bold enough to take it. Wallace and Clara McClinton were just driving home, minding their own business. They were everyday, hardworking folks, much like you or me, just trying to make it back to their own porch. They had no idea that a predator was tracking them from the dark, watching their headlights cut through the midnight mist. Roosevelt Daniels was the name that stepped out of the shadows. There was no hesitation in the man, no fear, and no mercy. He cocked that heavy iron right at their faces, stripping away their security in a single heartbeat. But see, Roosevelt was not just wanting their money. A regular thief takes the cash and runs into the night. But Roosevelt wanted something deeper. He wanted their peace. He wanted absolute dominion over their lives. At gunpoint, he forced that terrified couple into the trunk of their very own car. Think about that. Think about the final slam of that heavy metal trunk lid, shutting out the rest of the world. The darkness closing in, no air, no light, no way to protect the person you love. Just the sound of your own heart hammering against your ribs. That was his power. Roosevelt Daniels was not just a simple stick-up man from around the way. He was a man who fed on absolute control. He was a cold-blooded brother who looked at human lives like chess pieces, moving them around into the dark just because he had the power to do it. As the car drove away into the Illinois night, leaving nothing but tire tracks in the dirt, we have to stop and think about the nature of man. Was a person like this born with a crooked soul, or did this world break him down until he became a monster? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what your spirit tells you. This is the raw truth of true crime. We are shining a light on the boogeyman, and it is not pretty. The McClintons were trapped in that moving coffin, praying to the Almighty for just one more gulp of air, while Roosevelt sat in the driver's seat, cool as ice, holding their destiny in his hands. He was operating like a character out of a dark gangster movie, completely detached from human emotion, setting the stage for a lifetime of terror that would eventually bring the federal government to its knees. The loophole king. Every man and woman watching this knows that when the law finally puts its hands on you, the cage is supposed to slam shut. When you steal, when you kidnap, when you take a life, the system is designed to put you away so the hardworking folks can sleep easy at night. After that terrible night on the Illinois highway, after the police finally tracked Roosevelt Daniels down and put the cuffs on him for aggravated kidnapping and murder, the whole community took a collective sigh of relief. People looked at each other on their porches and said the monster was finally off the streets. They thought the story was over. They thought the book was closed. But Roosevelt Daniels was not your average street criminal. He did not look at jail bars the way other men did. Where regular men saw a dead end, Roosevelt saw an opportunity. Where ordinary people saw a stone cold wall of justice, he saw a system made of paper, full of cracks, full of holes, and completely ripe for the picking. He sat in that cell, completely unbothered, while his lawyers went to work, combing through the fine print of the law books. This is where the story takes a turn that will make your blood run cold. Roosevelt understood something that most folks do not realize until it is too late. The law is not always about right and wrong. Sometimes the law is just a game of chess, and if you have the right pieces and the right mindset, you can tip the board over. He started exploiting legal technicalities, pushing deadlines, questioning evidence, and playing the courts like a fine instrument. Year after year, while the families of his victims were trying to heal, Roosevelt was treating the justice system like a revolving door. By the time 1982 rolled around, less than 6 years after he put a God-fearing couple in the dark trunk of a car and ended another man's life over $60, Roosevelt Daniels walked out of those prison gates. He breathed in the fresh air, adjusted his jacket, and stepped right back onto the pavement as a free man. Think about the audacity of that. Think about the failure of the system that is supposed to protect your children and your elders. A man with blood on his hands and terror in his past was allowed to walk among everyday people like he had never done a single thing wrong. But the streets do not forget, and a wolf does not change his diet just because he spent a little time in a cage. The moment his feet hit the pavement, Roosevelt went right back to work. The ink on his release papers was barely dry before the police were hearing whispers about him again. Weapons charges, back alley deals, and dark whispers in the midnight hours followed him everywhere he went. By 1984, he was caught up in the system again, but just like before, he slipped right through their fingers. He knew exactly what to say, exactly how to move, and exactly which legal strings to pull to keep himself out of the deep dark. To our folks watching this, the elders who lived through those heavy years in the late 70s and early 80s, you know exactly how frustrating it was to see the system fail our neighborhood like that. You watch the news, you see the politicians talking big about cleaning up the streets, and then you see a man like Roosevelt Daniels treating the courthouse like his personal playground. It makes you question everything. It makes you ask yourself who the law is really protecting. Roosevelt was establishing a dangerous blueprint. He was proving to the underworld that if you are smart enough, if you are cold enough, and if you know how to manipulate the rules, the law cannot touch you. He was building a reputation as the man who could outsmart the judges, outrun the detectives, and outmaneuver the entire state of Illinois. He became an invisible king on the streets, a ghost that everyone knew was there, but nobody could seem to trap. This was not just luck. This was a calculated, cold-blooded understanding of human weakness and institutional corruption. Roosevelt Daniels was transitioning from a simple, violent highway predator into a sophisticated mastermind who looked at the entire legal structure of the United States and laughed. He was setting the stage for his biggest act yet, proving that the prison walls could not contain his ambition, and that his next move would take him from the streets of Illinois straight into the multi-million-dollar dark underbelly of the narcotics trade. By the time the mid-1980s rolled around, Roosevelt Daniels had outgrown the small-time hustle. He was no longer just the man waiting in the shadows on a dark highway. And he was no longer just a slick talker beating charges in a local courtroom. He had grander ambitions, and those ambitions were painted in the white powder that was flooding the streets of Chicago. The crack and cocaine epidemic was tearing through the urban landscape, destroying families and generating millions of dollars for anyone cold enough to control the supply. Roosevelt looked at that chaos and saw his kingdom. He dove headfirst into the high-stakes world of multi-kilo narcotics trafficking. He was not on the corner pitching bags. He was the man behind the man, organizing shipments, managing distribution lines, and watching the cash pile up in the dark. But the federal government was watching too. The FBI and the DA were putting together a massive net to clean up the streets. And in 1985, that net finally caught Roosevelt Daniels. They hit him with heavy federal drug charges, trafficking operations that carried real, unadulterated time. The prosecutors smiled, thinking they had finally put a permanent end to the legend of the untouchable mastermind. They locked him up in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago. This was a high-security federal facility, a concrete and steel fortress designed to hold the most dangerous elements of the underworld. It was supposed to be a place where a man's voice was silenced, where his influence was stripped away, and where his empire died. The government thought that by locking his body in a cell, they had severed the head of the snake. But this is the part of the story that separates the regular criminals from the true masterminds. Roosevelt Daniels did not let those prison walls restrict his business. Instead of his empire dying inside that jail, the Metropolitan Correctional Center became his new corporate headquarters. He looked around that prison and saw guards who did not make enough money, officials who could be bought, and a system that was just as corruptible on the inside as it was on the outside. He started using the prison's own inmate telephone system to run his multi-million-dollar drug operation on the streets of Chicago. Think about the sheer audacity of that. A man sitting in a federal cell, wearing a prison jumpsuit, eating prison food, but using the prison's own copper wires to direct shipments, negotiate prices, and order his soldiers around on. Outside, he was moving weight, setting up deals, and controlling the blocks without ever stepping a single foot past the guard towers. To make sure his operations ran smoothly, Roosevelt began spreading his wealth around the prison corridors. He corrupted the very men who were paid to watch him. He put correctional officers on his payroll, turning federal guards into his personal couriers and lookouts. If he needed information passed to the outside, a dirty guard took the message. If he needed a phone line cleared, the eyes looked the other way. He turned that high-security facility into his own private palace, proving that gold can melt even the heaviest iron bars. Our folks watching this, who lived through the 90s, you know how deep corruption can go when the money gets too loud. You watch these movies about the mafia and the kingpins running things from their cells, but Roosevelt Daniels was doing it in real life, right in the heart of Chicago. The federal agents on the outside were completely baffled. They were conducting wiretaps on street-level dealers, tracking shipments and seizing cash, but every single trail they followed kept leading them right back to the front doors of the federal prison. They could not believe their own data. The man they had locked away to stop the bleeding was the one pulling the strings the entire time. Roosevelt was living the ultimate anti-hero protocol. He had achieved total dominance over his environment. He was untouchable on the streets because he was already in jail. And he was untouchable in jail because he owned the people holding the keys. He had created a perfect loop of crime and protection, showing a level of strategic genius that left the federal authorities looking completely foolish. For years, he sat back and watched his bank accounts grow, ruling his empire like a ghost from inside the belly of the beast, leaving the government to wonder how a single man could make a mockery of the entire United States justice system. The final reckoning, the grandest illusions always have a way of shattering when the light finally hits them. Roosevelt Daniels had spent years treating the federal justice system like a playground, running a multi-million-dollar narcotics empire from the comfort of a high-security cell, completely convinced that he had built a machine that could never be broken. He believed that because he owned the guards, controlled the wires, and commanded the streets from behind concrete walls, he was completely beyond the reach of human consequence. But the federal government does not like to be made a fool of, especially not by a man they already have in handcuffs. A quiet storm was gathering outside the prison walls. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and top-tier federal prosecutors began realizing that their entire war on drugs in the city of Chicago was being undermined from within their own house. They put together a specialized, deeply secretive task force with one singular mission: to tear down the invisible kingdom of Roosevelt Daniels. They did not just go after the street-level soldiers this time. They started tapping the prison phones, tracking the financial footprints of correctional officers, and flipping Roosevelt's closest confidants, turning his own web of corruption against him. The hammer came down with an absolute, deafening fury. In the late 1980s, the feds brought forward a massive new indictment that shook the entire legal landscape of Illinois. They laid out the cold, hard data of his prison operation, exposing every single bribe, every single telephone call, and every single drug shipment he had authorized while wearing a government-issued jumpsuit. The dirty guards who had taken his money were stripped of their badges and thrown into cells of their own, leaving Roosevelt completely isolated, stripped of his protectors, and staring directly into the eyes of raw, uncompromised federal justice. When Roosevelt Daniels walked into that courtroom for his final trial, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of decades of crime. The elders in the community, the hardworking folks who remembered the terror of his 1976 highway kidnappings, and the families who had watched their neighborhoods get torn apart by the narcotics he distributed, all stood watching. There were no more loopholes to jump through. There were no more technicalities to exploit. The chessboard had been completely cleared, and the government was holding all the pieces. The judge looked down from the bench, seeing a man who had repeatedly mocked the very idea of law and order. A man who had used his brilliant mind not to lift his community up, but to drag it down into the dark for his own personal gain. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. Roosevelt Daniels was sentenced to 55 years in prison with absolutely no option for parole. In the federal system, 55 years with no parole is not just a sentence. It is a slow, living death. It meant that he would never again see the sunset over the Chicago skyline, never again walk the pavement as a free man, and never again hold dominion over another human soul. He was shipped away to a maximum security penitentiary far from the streets he used to rule, locked deep in the belly of the American penal system where his voice could no longer reach the outside world. The empire was dead. The ghost was finally caged. And the untouchable kingpin was reduced to nothing more than a number in a database. It was a brutal, cold conclusion to a life spent chasing power through terror, proving that no matter how smart the criminal, no matter how deep the corruption, the house of cards always collapses, in the end, leaving nothing but the ruins of a broken legacy. Chapter 5, The Legacy of the Shadows, the story of Roosevelt Daniels, does not truly end with the slamming of a prison door. Long after a mastermind is locked away in the dark, the ripples of his actions continue to wash over the streets, shaping the world for generations to come. When you look back at his life from the perspective of 30, 40, or 50 years later, you begin to see that he was not just a man who committed crimes. He was a symptom of a much deeper, much darker reality within the American urban landscape. He left behind a blueprint that fundamentally changed how the government, the police, and the community looked at the criminal underbelly. For the justice system, Roosevelt Daniels was a harsh, embarrassing wake-up call that forced the federal government to completely redesign the security of their institutions. The realization that a man could run a multi-million-dollar drug syndicate using federal prison phones forced authorities to implement strict monitoring systems, overhaul inmate communications, and heavily crack down on internal corruption among correctional officers. Every single time an inmate picks up a phone in a federal facility today, they are living under the shadow of the restrictions that Roosevelt Daniels forced the government to create. He showed them the cracks in their armor, and they spent decades welding those cracks shut. But the truest, most heartbreaking legacy of Roosevelt Daniels is written in the blocks and neighborhoods he left behind. To our elders watching this, you know the heavy toll that the crack and cocaine era took on our families. The money Roosevelt made from his cell was built on the destruction of everyday homes, on mothers losing their children, and on young men destroying their futures on the corners. The wealth was temporary, the power was an illusion, but the trauma inflicted on the community lasted for decades. He gave the world an example of absolute strategic genius, but he used that genius to fuel a fire that burned his own people. This brings us to the final, ultimate question of this entire journey. The question we must answer as we sit here in the quiet of the dark. What do we do with the memory of a man like Roosevelt Daniels? Do we look at him as a legend, an anti-hero who possessed a brilliant mind and had the audacity to stand up and manipulate a corrupt system to his own advantage? Or do we look at him simply as a monster, a predator who started his career trapping an innocent couple in the suffocating darkness of a car trunk and ended it trapping his own community in cycle of addiction and violence? We do not show flashy graphics on this channel because we want you to look past the glamour of the street legend and see the cold reality of the cost. Writing a script like this, talking about these dark chapters of our history, it is never easy, but it is necessary. It is necessary because if we do not study the masterminds of the dark, we will never learn how to protect the light. Roosevelt Daniels lived his life in the shadows, outsmarting everyone until the shadows finally swallowed him whole. The final verdict does not belong to the judges or the federal prosecutors anymore. The final verdict belongs to you. Let the Spirit guide your thoughts. Let me know your truth in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel as we continue to pull back the curtain on the deepest mysteries of dark side. Peace.